Luis Martínez Montes, you have written a global history of Spain, but surely you're exaggerating. Didn't globalization start only recently, around 30 years ago?
Thank you very much, Luis, first for having me, for giving me the opportunity to talk to our Turkish friends. It's really an honor. Let me start by saying that my first post as a diplomat was in Kazakhstan, a country which shares with Turkey not only belonging to the same religious, let's say, cultural sphere, but also a linguistic sphere. So I had the opportunity to learn about Turkey in a country which is at the far east of the Eurasian landmass, but which is connected very much thanks to the fact that they belong to the same cultural area, to Western Europe, to the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course, as I said, to the Islamic world, as it was the case with Spain. As you know, and our audience also is very familiar with the fact that Spain belonged to the Muslim ecumeny, to the Muslim civilization for 800 years, which is not a short span of time. But getting back to your question, I used the word global in a double sense, with a double meaning that the history of Spain has a global projection because it's one of the few countries, Turkey is another country also, which at some point in its history had the capacity to influence decisively the shaping of civilization, of history, global history. So that's the first sense of the word global Spain. It's the projection of its culture, its polity, because it was a global empire for 200 years, 200.5 years. And at the same time, as I said before, the capacity it had, this kind of countries, Spain, Turkey, the capacity to create a linguistic and cultural world. We talk about the Spanish-speaking world, we talk about the Turkish-speaking world. As I said before, it was the case of much of Central Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's the first meaning. The second is, as you pointed out, the fact that when we read about global history, normally we think that globalization is something that started 100 years ago, let's say in the 19th century. It was something that was connected to industrialization and to the creation of the colonial empires by Britain, France, the Netherlands, and so on. But in fact, globalization as such started much earlier. We can say that there were, of course, ways and means by which different cultures connected to each other. The Silk Road, for instance, was a case in point, from Rome to the former capital of the Chinese Empire, Chang'an, in the 8th, 9th centuries. So it was the case also with the connections between Eastern Africa via the Arabian Peninsula with India. It was the case also from Western Africa, Northern Africa, with the Ashanti Empire. So those were fragmented globalizations. Important regionally, but they were not global in scope. The difference was that with the projection of Spanish and also Portuguese power in the 16th century, with the age of discoveries at that time, the world became one. And the main actors of that basic fact, which changed world history forever, were, as I said before, nor English bankers or American industrialists or Dutch traders, but Spanish and Portuguese. discoverers, navigators, imperial administrators, missionaries, traders. So that was a pivotal time in history. That's the second meaning of Spain, let's say, as a global country. The fact that it contributed decisively to the creation of the first wave of globalization.
Mm-hmm. Our societies are no longer monolithic, and they are diverse, they are pluralistic. You know? They embody many different cultures and religions and worldviews. But in your book, you claim, again, that this is not a new phenomenon. This was already the case in the Hispanic Empire. How did it come to happen, and what were the ways in which the Hispanic Empire was so diverse?
It's a very pertinent question. And it has to do with the purpose that moved me to write this book. Because for non-Spanish speaking audiences, the knowledge about Spain and the Spanish Empire is mainly mediated by English and American authors. So in a sense, Anglo-American historians have told the tales of global history from their vintage point of view, from the vantage point of view, in the sense that even though they try to explain, for instance, the history of Spain, the history of Turkey, the history of China, the history of India, so many countries, and they do it quite well. I mean, stylistically, it's a pleasure normally to read Anglo-American historians when they write these kinds of global histories. But they do it from their point of view. Is, let's say, an unavoidable fact of life. I mean, they belong to a particular culture and they see the world through the prism of that culture. So I wanted the tale of a country like Spain, and as I said before, it's a country that has contributed in many ways to the shaping of world history from a Hispanic point of view, not a strictly Spanish point of view, but Hispanic point of view. Because for me, it is a mistake. You cannot understand the history of Spain without taking that broader perspective. And it has to do with your question. One of the main messages of my book is that Spain has gone through a series of cycles, which can be explained not only in political terms, but mainly in cultural terms. So it's a country that was first incorporated into a larger cultural sphere, the Roman Empire. Then via the barbarian invasions, the Visigoths at the end of the Roman Empire, into a Germanic-speaking or Proto-Germanic-speaking world. And then with the Arab invasion in the 8th century, into a much larger sphere, which was the Islamic world. So at that time, Spain, during those three cycles of invasions and incorporations into our history of Roman, Gothic, and Muslim elements, Spain served mainly as, let's say, a cultural cauldron. I mean, it's one of the few countries in Western Europe, probably the only one, which went through so diverse experiences in such a relatively short period of time. I mean, imagine in 300th century, someone being born in Toledo, in central Spain, being a Roman, a Visigoth, and then a Muslim. So that gave us, as a country, a unique connection with so many different linguistic, religious, artistic, cultural experiences. That's unique in Western Europe. And it enriched us, but at the same time, it complicated our history to a large degree. So when finally, after 800 years, of experience of cohabitation with the Muslim world, the Catholic kings unified what we know now as Spain, I mean the amalgamation of the Kingdom of Castilla and the Kingdom of Aragon. We tend to forget that that incorporation did not obliterate the experience that we had with the Muslim world. We tend, and this is one of the main topics about the history of Spain, we tend to think that since the 16th century, since there was the expulsion of the Jews and also the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, that Spain became a monolithic country. I mean, the Inquisition, as I said, the attempt at creating a very homogeneous, from a cultural and religious point of view, polity. It was the case to a certain extent, but that's not the whole history. It's very interesting if you visit, for instance, some Latin American countries. Let's travel a little bit with our imagination to Peru. Well, in a small village in Peru, you find a church in the Andes. You see it from outside. It's called the Church of San Pedro in a small village called Andoailillas. And you see it as a typical, Western European church. You get inside and what you see is magnificent because you have plenty of paintings in the Western classical tradition, but then you look up at the ceiling and what you see is a mudéjar ceiling, a typically Muslim ceiling in a Catholic church in the middle of the Andes, in the Americas. So that gives you an idea about the global connections that Spain was able to make because of that unique cultural heritage. When you go to Mexico, for instance, there is a museum I like very much there in Mexico City, which is called the France Mayer Museum. And it has this wonderful, it's called the Byobu screens, the Namban Byobus. They are Japanese screens, but with Western paintings. Why was it so? Why can you find a Japanese screen in Mexico with Western topics? And not only Western, because some of them depict the conquest of Tenochtitlan by Cortés. So again, you have Asian motifs or an Asian technique in Mexico, in the Americas, telling a history of the confrontation or the invasion, encounter of America by Europe. So that was made possible because the global Spain was also present in Asia via the Philippines. And thanks to that presence, there was a unique cultural and economic material exchange with China. So via the Manila galleons, which sail twice per year from Manila to Acapulco, and then by land to Veracruz, and then thanks to the Atlantic fleets to Sevilla, to Europe, you saw those three continents, Asia, America, and Europe, connected on a regular basis. Again, that was the origin of globalization, but it was also the origin of that pluralistic empire that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. The idea that contrary towards the English imperial experience or the Dutch imperial experience was supposed to be, in the sense that they were supposed to be more open, tolerant of religious dissents and so on and so forth, that's not true. Another way to see the difference between how pluralistic the Spanish Empire was and how Anglo-centric, for instance, the English Empire was, is by visiting a museum, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. When you see the rooms devoted to colonial art, to Anglo-American colonial art, what you see are portraits, family portraits of Anglo-American colonists. They are white, they are European. The sittings they were painted in were like English, typical English rooms or settings. There was nothing that could tell you that that painting was made in Boston, in America. There was no connection with the local environment. So it was just a transplant of England in the west, in the eastern American seaboard, northeastern American seaboard. Now you visit again the France Mayor Museum in Mexico, or the National Museum in Lima, or the Museum of America in Madrid, and you see similar paintings around the same time, 17th, 18th centuries. And what you see are mixed doubles. For instance, an Spaniard and an Amerindian lady with a mestizo child in an American environment. And those were called the casta paintings because they portrayed the extraordinary variety of the different kind of mixings that were going on in Spanish America at the time. So you have like 52, 53 categories of mixing of bloods. I mean, you have from mulatto and black, you had such a type. From Amerindian and mulatto, you had another type, and so on and so forth. And there were families. I mean, they were entitled to have property. They were entitled to have, I mean, the Amerindian wives of Spaniards were entitled to have the family name, and their offspring were entitled to the legacy of their parents. I mean, they could have, an Amerindian child could have a right to the property of his Spanish father legally. So that was not the case in Anglo-American. It was a pluralistic empire. Yes, I'm not saying that it was an ideal empire. No empire is ideal, of course. Empires to our modern minds, 21st century minds, are, let's say, abhorrent because they mean the subjection of peoples to another power. So I'm not going that way. In my book, I am not trying to legitimize what an empire is. I'm not saying that Spain should recreate another empire, or England should do the same, or Turkey should do the same. No, that's not the case. What I'm saying is that empires have been, and still are, a fact of life, a fact of history. Most of modern states were built either as a result of the demise of empires or the fragmentation of empires, or many of them with another name are empires because they encompass different cultures, peoples, religions, languages, and so on. So it's true that throughout history, multinational, multi-religious, multilinguistic empires have been an instrument for humankind to mix, to connect. And that's a fact. Culturally, linguistically, artistically, politically, and so on and so forth. And we should, let's say, be able at least to recognize that.
Let's say that if we take away the domination side of empires, but we keep under a consent, let's say, contract, we keep the multicultural or pluralistic nature of those societies. Would it be possible to draw some lessons for today's society? Since probably the issue of our time, let's say, is how to manage diversity while respecting diverse worldviews, religions, beliefs, at the same time keeping society together and being able to keep cohesion of society. I think this is one of the great challenges of our time. The empires did that, of course, not through consent, but rather through force, or if you want, through might, but still, as you were saying, they managed to create a polity where several identities could coexist in some ways. So are there practical lessons, let's say? Is there something valuable we can learn from reading the history of those empires?
Yes, of course. That's the point precisely. Look, I'm now in Brussels, for instance, so I deal with the European Union affairs. So what Europe is trying to do is to create a supranational entity that goes beyond the national state. It's difficult, but in many aspects we are there. I mean, we manage our finances, our economies, our borders. We share our experiences as students, thanks to Erasmus and so on and so forth, beyond and across national boundaries within the European Union, which is a wonderful historical experience, and it's still halfway to the end destination we would like to achieve. But if you look, for instance, at the experience of the Spanish monarchy, again, there is a misconception saying that it was something ruled from Madrid or from El Escorial, and then automatically the orders given by Philip II or Philip III or the Fourth or Charles III in the 18th century were transmitted to Manila, to Mexico, to the Andes, to Amberes here in Belgium, or to Naples in Italy. Because we should not forget that the Spanish monarchy also had a very important presence in Europe. It was global not only in the sense that it encompassed the Americas or part of the Asia Pacific, but many parts of Europe, as we know it's Western Europe, were also part of the Spanish monarchy. So being such a huge polity, it meant that the command and control system of governance didn't work. I mean, when some authors compare the Spanish monarchy at the peak of its power with another kind of monolithic empires, I mean, I have even heard when I was in Moscow that it was a kind of Soviet Union. No, it had absolutely nothing to do. The way Milan or Naples or Brussels or Bruges was governed was very different to the way Mexico or the Andes or the Philippines were governed. I mean, there was a constant adaptation to the local circumstances and a lot of compromise with local elites. So a lesson is that an empire is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street or a multiple ways street. I will give you some examples of that. If, again, you go to the outskirts of Mexico City, now there is a neighborhood called Tlatelolco. So in Tlatelolco in 1535, many years after the conquest of Tenochtitlan of the Aztec Empire, the Spanish Viceroy and the Church created a college. It was actually the first college of high learning in the Americas. It was a university, Santo Domingo, fine. Of course, not Harvard, not Yale. That came much later. I mean, the first universities, Western-style universities created in the Americas, were created in Spanish America. And by the way, the first Western-style university created in Asia was created in the Philippines. It is still at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, created in the early 17th century, founded in the early 17th century. But getting back to Tlatelolco, that college was created to teach the children of the Aztec nobility Latin, Greek, but also Nahuatl, the main Mexican language. And many missionaries and colonial administrators, Spaniards, teaching there also learn Nahuatl. One of them was Bernardino de Sahagún. For some, including myself, the founder of modern anthropology, comparative anthropology, because he was the one who collected the ancient Aztec myths and histories and translated it into the Codex Florentinum, which is probably still the main book explaining how the Aztec civilization worked. In terms of religion, in terms of politics, in terms of culture, gastronomy, and so on and so forth. So the fact that the Spaniard could learn about the Aztec civilization, and at the same time the offspring of the Aztec nobility could learn about Western civilization, was made possible not in Madrid, not in Naples, not in Bruges, but in Mexico. So it was, as I said, a two-way street. We learn as Spaniards from those cultures, they learn from us. Very few people know, for instance, that the same happened in Manila, in the Philippines. If you go to Madrid, to the National Library, there you can find the first Chinese book translated into a Western European language. It's called the Vens in Pokam. In English, it will be something like, the Chinese are very poetic, as you know, the luminous mirror to the enlightened heart. So that book, which is a compilation of Chinese literature, classical Chinese literature, was translated at the end of the 16th century by a Spanish missionary, Juan Cobo, who was sent to Manila. And in Manila, he met a lot of Chinese traders, merchants, who were exchanging silk, ceramics for American silver in the Parian of Manila, the main market of Manila. That was one of the main meeting points between East and West. And not only economically, again, we can get back to the history of the early globalization. It should be known that, for instance, 50% of the production of silver from Mexico ended up in Chinese hands. Up to the 19th century, there were still in the 19th century Spanish-American pesos as legal currency circulating in China with Chinese ideograms on it. You have the face of Charles IV, the Spanish king at the time, but with ideograms inscribed on his face. So again, just to tell you that globalization didn't start in the 19th century. It was something that was going on early on. But as I said, getting back to the history of this Chinese book translated into Spanish in Manila, it was thanks to those connections that for the first time on a regular basis, the East met the West. Because in medieval times, you had, of course, Marco Polo. Well, fine. You had some missionaries going to Cambaluc, the capital of China, and so on. But it was, they were irregular and, let's say, very sporadic encounters. What you have since the 16th century is a regular connection, as I said before, twice a year from Manila to America, to Spain, to Europe. Thanks to the galleons and the Spanish Atlantic fleets. That changed completely the history of the world, of course. But again, I don't want to expand on this. We have many other topics to talk about.